Are last names really the end of all the endings? Hey, it's Alex with the Name Mentor / Names and Coffee / Name Pros podcast. Hey, welcome to season 4. I had a little bit of a break in between because I had a baby. I'm getting back into the swing of things, and I'm so excited about this season's podcast because I'm going to have so many cool people on that I just cannot wait to share their insights with you. I'm super jazzed. So, last names. This is something that I've been chewing on for a couple of years. I had some people reach out to me and be like, hey, do you do last names? Like, do you help find new last names? And I was like, yes, I help with last names. Last names are interesting pieces of us as people, and the reality of having a last name is only a couple hundred years old. It's not really a very old thing at all. And yet it seems like this concrete thing. It's in our laws and in legal processes and all this jazz. I wanted to start this episode off with a story. So, for those of you who have known me for a hot second, know that I love walking through cemeteries. I feel like the people there are friends that I've never met, but I have met, that I kind of know, that I want to know, that I don't know. It's just a peaceful place, and I love the idea that there are just amazing people who have lived that we'll just never know about. This idea of legacy, the millennial crisis of wanting to be relevant and wanting to be remembered. I think it's kind of all the things for me, but I just find a lot of closure walking in cemeteries. I feel very safe and at peace. Please don't ask me to do it at 1 a.m. because 1, that's past my bedtime. Secondly, I'm good. But in the daylight hours, I love walking through cemeteries. I feel very safe until I don't feel safe. So I like to walk through cemeteries, and when I tell my kids, I'm going for a walk, they say, where are you going? I say, to my favorite place. And they go, the cemetery. One of the major reasons I probably love walking through cemeteries are the names, because the older the cemetery is, the more amazing the names are. And I have a very old cemetery near my house. You see dates from the 1800s in the cemetery. I think the earliest I found was somebody from like 1820 or 1830 who had been born there. Just very special. So I walk around the cemetery, and if you know anything about cemeteries, they're grouped mostly by families in alphabetical sections, right? I would imagine that conversation of people choosing to do that started with, bodies are dropping everywhere and we can't find them. So we got to group these peeps together. But the names on top of the headstones are all different kinds of names, all different kinds of ethnicities. But if you didn't know that it was last names on headstones, you would just think that they were first names. In my cemetery, I've seen Allison and Every and Smith and Jones, like all of these different kinds of names. And I don't know if any of you follow Names with Steph. She has a book called Names Don't Have a Gender, which I think is an interesting concept to chew on, that a guy with the last name Allison is totally societally acceptable, but if his first name is Allison, people have a hard time with that, except once upon a time there were guys named Madison and Harper and Whitney, because they were boys' names that have shifted to girls' names. And it's just, names with genders is a very interesting conversation to have. But with last names, you see words, you see just regular names in all different languages, right? And I think that's so fascinating. And so if someone has come to me with one of a couple different scenarios, no longer relate to fit your family and you've been divorced and you need a shift, or you have a toxic family and your family's had a certain legacy that you don't want to be a part of anymore, you are getting married to somebody and you want to start fresh, have your family name, or what last name are your kids going to have? Should they have a smush of the two last names together or something new? Like, sometimes what seems so straightforward can suddenly feel so daunting and confusing if you have put on the table the idea of changing your last name. Like, talking about changing your first name is major, but I feel like talking about changing your last name is like 10 times harder, because your name is personal, last name is legacy, right? You're wanting to create an identity for yourself that can be shared and passed on. Last names, how they began was you had 3,000 million Johns, and somebody was like, John who? Which John? Oh, John the blacksmith. John the tall guy. John the guy who is constantly painting himself green. John the guy that thinks he's some sort of knight in shining armor. This John who does roofs. So then John Thatcher, John Green, John Melancholy, John Everly, like all of these names began to delineate certain people. Then that became the legacy of, oh, you're the son of John the blacksmith. Now you're John O. Smith or John McSmith or John Max Smith or just John Smith, depending on what part of the world you're from. So you have locative names, John Underhill. You have occupational names, John Thatcher. You have names that were rank, John General. You have nickname last names, John Little. You have patronymic names, where names that come from patriarchy. I am John Johnson. Then you have matronymic names, John, Mary. I don't know. And typically with patronymic and matronymic systems, the one that was the most important or had more rank was the last name that was given. So like King Henry II, I think, has Fitzim Press, I don't know how you want to pronounce that. He was the son of an empress, so he has his mother's last name as one of his surnames. He has multiple surnames. There are a lot of Spanish cultures that are matronymic, so the children just get the mother's last name. And then, of course, you have America, which is very patriarchal, and male names immediately get passed along without even a second thought. I think just now we're starting to lift up our heads and say, I think last names are more complicated than how they've just been done in America for 200 years. I'm sure you saw this video go around. I think it started on TikTok a few years ago, where this woman said, that moment you realize your grandmother's last name was her father's name and that women have never had their own last name. And I think that's a powerful thought. It's not exactly true, but it is interesting. And I was having a conversation with somebody who loves their grandmother dearly, and they're considering changing their last name. And they were saying to me, I would love to take my grandmother's last name, except my grandmother's last name was her father's name. So I'm not really honoring her by taking her maiden name. And I think that's kind of a cut and dry way to look at it, because it's so much more complicated and layered. I think that as humans, we want things to be black and white so badly, to be easily understood. But especially when it comes to names are so nuanced, they're so layered. They are identity. So you're walking through very colorful territory. I don't think it's cut and dry. Like, yes, your grandmother's maiden name was just her father's name, which came from his father and his father and his father and his father. But at the end of the day, that was her last name. It's honoring her because it is her name. She is representing a family, a legacy, a story. That is the name that she went with her whole entire life. So you can say, well, she didn't choose it. But that's just her name. That's her name. Black and white, straight up. That is her name. That's the name she's had for her life. Whether she chose to keep her maiden name or she chose to keep her married name, whatever name you're talking about, that is your grandmother's story. My grandmother's name, I've spoken about this before. My grandmother's name was Dorcas, and she hated it. She was named after her mother's best friend, so she always went by Dottie. So by me naming my daughter Dorcas or taking on the last name Dorcas is not honoring her. If you are wanting to take on your grandmother's identity as a new legacy for you and your family, go back and listen to my podcast episode called Names That Honor, because I unpack this idea that you don't just, now for all the people who disagree with me, I need you to take a breath and just deep breathe and just embrace what I'm about to say, even if you don't agree with it, because it's totally okay. I'll squeeze your hand after, I promise. To honor somebody, you do not have to use their name. That is not the only way to honor. And the proof of that is walking through a cemetery. Honoring is so layered. Go to Ancestry.com and look up your census or your family history, and you're going to see how layered honoring is. Sadie's honoring Sarah's, Molly's honoring Mary's, Pearl's honoring Margaret's, and vice versa. Like, Jack's honoring John's. Who came up with this? It's insane. So to just say you have to use their exact name to honor, to me, is very short-sighted, because that's just not even how it's always happened. If you believe that, I love you, and you have made your life so much easier by being black and white about this. But if you are somebody that is embracing the complicated part of, for example, your grandmother, and you want to carry on your grandmother's legacy in your family, honoring essence, honoring who they are. If your grandmother could have chosen any last name for herself, what would she have chosen? What was her favorite? What's her favorite thing? What's her favorite color? So if your grandmother's last name was Penelope Martin, okay, and I'm making that up. So if you're a Penelope Martin, I don't know you. Penelope Martin, and you knew she hated her last name, her maiden name. Martins, terrible people, right? But her whole entire house is blue. Blue is her favorite color. Blue everywhere, right? So then taking on the last name Blue honors your Penelope grandmother. Or if your grandmother was a florist and she just lived and breathed flowers, and that was her legacy, she could be Penelope Flora to you, right? thinking about it in that way to embody legacy, for that last names become a story, because that's how last names originated to begin with. They were rooted in identity and were a story. They were the character of a story. Jack Smith, Jack Thatcher. That's a story. And I think that is so fun and powerful. So to walk into the conversation of changing your last name has to be legacy minded, because it is bigger than you. Even if you are somebody that says, I'm not having kids, this is just for me, you are being short-sighted by saying you're not going to make an impact, unless you're just planning on being Silas Marner or Scrooge McDuck. If you are creating a legacy of people around you where there might be a possibility of you being honored someday, or your name being on a building, you are going to make an impact in lives. So your last name is bigger than you. It is legacy. What do you want people to say of you? What last name do you want people to give their children? And I know that sounds like a lot, because it is a lot, but you have to, I think, to combat overwhelm, I think you need to get a pen and paper and say, what does legacy mean to me? What are some of the people in my life that I thought just had the coolest last name, or were so kind to me, who changed my life, who impacted me? And write that all down and see the golden thread that connects all of that. If you don't have anybody and you're starting new, okay, well, what's important to you? What do you see as important in humankind overall? What does legacy mean to you, right? Find a way to combat the overwhelm by finding principles and standards that you want to live by. I don't necessarily think that you should be giving yourself the last name McDuck. I think first names, middle names, and last names need to be given and worn with dignity. So here in America, we talk about our history surrounding the Civil War and the atrocities that happened to Black culture. And when the Civil War ended and people were freed, we know that, were they? This has been a lot to unpack and make right and talk about. It's been an important conversation. But I'm not qualified to talk about that. But what I do want to talk about, which I think is really cool, really amazing, and well thought out, when people were freed and they suddenly needed to decide what last name to have for themselves to be able to do commerce and to finally have this by law identity. Some people took on the last names of where they had been, in the hopes that dispersed family could find their way back to each other. And some people took the last name of prominent white figures. And this is something that I didn't realize, but I'd always wondered about in the back of my head, like when I was coming up through school and I heard of, George Washington Carver. I was like, what? That's interesting. And it seemed at the time more Black culture to me than white culture. It wasn't very often that I would hear of a white person being named after another prominent white person. And now I've realized that is very clever, because George Washington Carver walking into a room carried the weight of George Washington with him, right? And this is just purely a name discussion. But they named themselves after prominent white people to carry the weight of that, the dignity of that with them as they were trying to now build their own identity in their own new life. There is a power of names. And do I wish that they didn't have to do that? Yeah, in a million, trillion, 100%. But I think that it's an important name conversation to have when it comes down to us talking about name legacy, name identity. Maya Angelou talked about the power of words. It is the same thing with names. Names can either tear down a family or build up a family. And I think one of the catalysts of this last name conversation has come on the heels of people going no contact and talking about toxicity and talking about needing healing and putting distance between yourself and really harmful parents. And if you are somebody that has come from harmful parent after harmful parent after harmful parent, it's like you can say, once upon a time, they were just a kid and they had bad things happen to them and now here they are. But at the end of the day, you're either a good person or you're not a good person. And so if your parent and their legacy are just super harmful and you are saying it ends with me including this last name, I think that's very powerful. And that's not unusual in the arc of time. It's only unusual here in America because things have always been exactly the same. People like to go to the metronome of how it's always been. And change is uncomfortable, but I think it's necessary, and it takes people beginning to make it the norm. Once upon a time, somebody naming their kid North caused a ripple throughout the globe of all of these varying opinions. Somebody naming their kid North today is not that big of a deal. And unfortunately, it's just an example of somebody had to start it. And that's literally with everything. Somebody had to take a last name first. And now here we are, right? But there's also this beauty to legacy and this beauty to last names. I saw recently on another viral video of these two sisters going and getting their maiden names, aka their dad's name, as they said, tattooed on their arms to remember him and his family legacy because there was no sons to carry on the name. And I thought that was so beautiful. And it got me thinking of my own grandpa, who was the very last of his family. And he never had grown children. So when he passed away, that's it. And I think how many times that has probably happened over the course of mankind and is just legacy passing away. But in the world where last names did not exist, people still found a way to honor people, right? Family and legacy is the story of where you've come from, whether it's good or bad. It's a mess. It's good, it's bad, it's a mess. And I think that you have to decide within yourself what is my legacy going to be and what legacy do I want to pass on. It feels very pioneerish that you are making the stand, and it is a stand. It's not a wrong stand, but I think that You just have to be willing to go through the process and take time to figure this out and feel good about it. There are so many amazing resources unpacking the etymology of last names, scholars that deserve the recognition of all of their hard work. And I just want to take a minute to honor all of the scholars that are preserving this idea of names, because names are truly so powerful. And I just love this space, and I love talking about names. There are so many name people around today that have so many tips and tricks for all of these different scenarios. I'm not the only one. So if you're on this journey, I encourage you to go find them. But this is just some of my food for thought as it relates to last names. And I don't think it's the end of all the endings. I think that a last name can be the beginning of something really, really beautiful. And hey, if you like this podcast, like and subscribe and leave a comment. It helps get the name info out there to help people. And follow me along on Instagram and check out my website, thenamementor.com. Love you bunches. You're strong and you're kind, and you've got this.